Welcome everybody to yet another Authors at Google talk. Today with us is best-selling New York Times author Peter Singer. He wrote a very important book on cyber war. Our own Eric Schmidt says this is an essential read. My dear colleagues, I will repeat this for you. This is an essential read. So we do have copies of the book on sale. This is the way it looks like. Please go and buy the book, even if you've seen this talk. Peter is a great author in many respects, but what he did for cyber security and cyber warfare in particular is he expanded on a field that is growing and that we know is becoming increasingly important, not only from the infrastructure standpoint, but also for international relations. I'm going to let Peter actually take it from here. Thank you, Peter.
All right. Thank you for the kind introduction. So it's a little bit daunting to be talking on this topic because at a company like this, because I remember the very first time that I ever saw a computer. My father took me to a science center down in North Carolina, and I got to see a Commodore, if you remember those. And I took a class on how to program, learning an entire new language for the sole purpose of making a smiley face out of the letter M that printed out on one of those old spool printers that you tore the perforated paper off the sides, if you remember that. Now, since then, the centrality of computers to my life, your life, the entire world, it's almost impossible to fathom. We live in a world where more than 40 trillion emails are sent every single year. From the first website was made in 1991. Now, according to your own analytics, there's more than 30 trillion individual web pages out there. Moreover, the internet is not just about compiling and sharing information. It's also having impact out on the real world via the emerging Internet of Things. According to Cisco, we'll see more than 40 billion devices internet-enabled over the next 5 years as everything from thermostats to cars to refrigerators to technologies literally not yet invented or imagined all come online and all start to carry on conversations without us. So in short, domains that range from communication to commerce to critical infrastructure to even conflict. 98% of US military communications goes over the civilian-owned and operated internet. All of these spaces are dependent on it. So we're in an age of cyber dependency. But in the short history of the internet, I would argue that we've reached a critical turning point. And it's because while the positive side of cyberspace is rippling out, so too are the risks, the negative side. There's all sorts of ways you can illustrate this. You can illustrate it with the raw numbers. Every second, 9 new pieces of malware are discovered. 97% of Fortune 500 companies know that they've been hacked, and the other 3% have been too. They just aren't willing to admit it to themselves. More than 100 governments have created some kind of cyber military command, some kind of military unit designed to fight and win wars in cyberspace and beyond. And indeed, the very first Pew poll to kick off 2014 found that Americans are more afraid of a cyber attack than they are of North Korean nuclear weapons, Iranian nuclear weapons, the rise of China, Russia, or climate change. So these fears, they've coalesced into one of the most rapidly growing industries in the entire world. They've also driven a massive bureaucratic growth at the national governmental level, not just in the United States. Just earlier today, France announced that it was spending another $2 billion in its military on cybersecurity issues and cyber war. But also we see it at the state level and even at the local level, where you see cities like Los Angeles, for example, creating cybersecurity centers. What all this together means is that for all the hope and promise of the new digital age, we also live in an era of cyber insecurity, if we're really being honest about it. And so before I go much further, it's at this point I'm going to try and do something that's a little bit counterintuitive, but will maybe hope make that point about cyber insecurity. And a lot like the challenge of trying to write a book about cybersecurity and make it interesting, you also have the challenge of how do you give a talk about it and give visuals that make it interesting. So what I did, and if with Boris's help, hopefully it'll play for us here, is I've assembled what I think are some of the best illustrations of cyber war art and some of the worst illustrations of it. And it's going to play in front of me. I'm not going to speak to it. It's going to continue to flash for a couple of reasons. One, to tell that story of cyber insecurity, but also because data has found that you're 60% more likely to retain what I'm saying if you look at a picture, even if the picture has nothing to do with what I'm saying. It's just the way us humans work. And that actually goes to a broader lesson that the book explores, and we'll talk about later on, which is that we're humans, we're strange, we're weird, but that's what drives all of these things. So let's pull back on all of this and wrestle with the question of why a book on cybersecurity and cyber war, and why now? There's two quotes that motivated me that basically encapsulate this. The first is from President Obama, who declared that cybersecurity risks pose, quote, the most serious economic and national security challenges of the 21st century. The second quote is from the former CIA director, who said, quote, rarely has something been so important and so talked about with less and less clarity and less apparent understanding. And you can see I really do want to talk to this one, but we'll keep moving on. So let's explore this gap. We see it in all sorts of fields. From the 70% of business executives, not 70% of CTOs, CSOs, CIOs, but 70% of business executives in general in any industry who have made a cybersecurity decision for their company, despite the fact that no major MBA program teaches it as part of your normal business management training and responsibility. That same kind of gap in training happens at the schools we teach our diplomats, our lawyers, our journalists, our generals. Or anecdotes, and there's just an array of funny, but in a certain way sad anecdotes that populate the book, from the opening of the book where a Pentagon official is telling us how important this all is, but he describes it as, quote, this cyber stuff. When you can only call something stuff, but you know it's important, that's not a good place to be in. Or the former Secretary of Homeland Security, the agency that is ostensibly in charge of cybersecurity on the civilian side for the United States, who has actually now taken over as chancellor of the university system out here in California, who proudly talked to us about the fact that she doesn't use email, and in fact hasn't used social media for over a decade. Not because she doesn't think it's secure, but because she just doesn't think it's useful. That same phenomena is happening on the judicial branch, where, for example, a Supreme Court justice talked about how they, quote, hadn't yet gotten around to email. Now, this is obviously worrisome to folks here working on the Gmail account, but there's a broader question of what does this mean for justices that in the upcoming year are going to decide everything from maybe net neutrality questions to the legality of some of the things that the NSA was doing when they just haven't yet gotten around to email. This cyber stuff problem is not just an American phenomenon. We saw the same thing in meetings with leaders in China, UAE, France, Great Britain. The head of cybersecurity in Australia had never heard of Tor, obviously a critical technology in this space. Now, the result is that cybersecurity is as crucial to areas as intimate as your personal privacy, to the security of your bank account, to as weighty as the future of world politics itself. But it's been treated as an issue only for the IT crowd, for the IT folks. In turn, the technical community that understands the workings of the software and the hardware hasn't dealt very well with the wetware, with the human side, and particularly the ripple effects of this into other worlds, be it policy, law, war, you name it. They've often looked at the world through a very specific lens and failed to appreciate some of the broader pictures out there. Now, the dangers of this are diverse. Each of us, in whatever role we play in life, must make decisions about cybersecurity that shape the future of the world well beyond just the online world. But too often we do so without the proper tools, basic terms and essential definitions that define both what's possible but also what's proper, what's right and wrong, are missed, or even worse, distorted. Past myth and future hype often weave together, obscuring what actually happened with where we really are now. And so the result is that some threats are overblown and overreacted to, and other threats are ignored. So, for example, as someone who loves history, it absolutely pains me when I hear people, and people who've done this range from senior government leaders like senators, to generals, to prominent news columnists, describe how we are in a parallel to the Cold War. Or as a cabinet official told me that malware was, quote, just like a WMD. And that's why we needed to approach it in the same kind of deterrence theory that we used in the Cold War. What these people fail to appreciate is the parallel to the Cold War is not the one they think they're making. The best, if you understand both the historic side and the technical side, the best parallel to the Cold War, actually those early days, we didn't understand well either the technology, but even more so the political dynamics that it was driving. The period of time where we took the real life versions of Dr. Strangelove seriously. So as an illustration in the book, we explore the episode where the US Air Force actually had a serious plan to nuke the moon to show the Soviets that we could do interesting stuff in space too. Those are not historic lessons we should be drawing in terms of the how-tos, but that's often what the discourse is. And let me go into some of the manifestations of this disconnect and how they play out and why they matter. One in particular is that we often lump things together that are unlike simply because they involve zeros and ones. So take the idea of a cyber attack. General Alexander, who is simultaneously the commander of US military's cyber command and double-hatted as the head of the NSA, which there's some very interesting problems with that, but let's move beyond that. He testified to Congress, quote, "Every day, America's armed forces face millions of cyber attacks." But to get those numbers, he was combining a variety of like and unlike things. He was combining everything from probes and address scans that never entered networks to unsuccessful attempts to get in that ranged from kids carrying out pranks to attempts at political protests to attempts to get in to carry out some kind of theft or an act of espionage. But none of those millions of attacks was what his listeners in Congress thought he was talking about, which was the so-called cyber Pearl Harbor or cyber 9/11 that actually there's been over 500,000 media and government speech references to. And that's what his boss, the Secretary of Defense, was warning everyone about. Essentially, what we're doing is that we're bundling together all of these activities simply because they involve software, which would be a lot like bundling together the activities of a group of teenagers with firecrackers, a group of political protesters in the street with a smoke bomb, James Bond with his Walter PPK missile, a terrorist with a roadside bomb, and a Russian cruise missile, and saying these are all the same because they involve the chemistry of gunpowder. We've bundled them together on the digital side because they all involve the internet. Or take the organizations. I had a senior US military official argue with me that Anonymous and Al-Qaeda were the same thing. Now, however you come down on Anonymous, and I've actually, I'm, I guess, far more empathetic towards them than what you would expect from people coming from DC. But the bottom line is, wherever you come down on them, they have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda in terms of their organization, their means, their ends, their causes. Basically, the only thing they're related is they're both non-state actors that begin with the letter A. But that was the belief. Now, these gaps in understanding, these disconnects of policy and reality, mean that we're not only seeing growing tension, And we explore this in particular in meetings with US and Chinese officials who would be negotiating on core questions of cybersecurity. And yet, as an illustration, one State Department official going off to one of these negotiations actually asked us what an ISP was, which, to make that Cold War parallel would be like going off to negotiate with the Soviets and not knowing what an ICBM is. But the point is, it's not only driving tension, it's leading to us being taken advantage of. And that can happen at the individual level when you get tricked to send your mom your bank account information because she's stuck in Thailand. You didn't know she was in Thailand, but gosh, you just need to help her out. To more serious illustrations of this, like at the G20 conference, the most important international conference of the year, diplomats were spearphished by, they received an email that had a wonderful offer for them. It said, if you click this link, you will be able to see nude photos of the French First Lady. And many of these senior diplomats clicked the link, and unfortunately they didn't get to see the nude photos, but they did download spyware onto their accounts. Again, senior government officials. To being taken advantage of at the business organizational level, either alternatively not doing enough to protect the business, or hiring hucksters who offer 100% security with some kind of silver bullet solution. Or frankly, being taken advantage of at the national political level, which is, I think, behind a number of the issues surrounding the current Snowden NSA scandal. This can even happen to a president. Reportedly, Obama expressed his, quote, frustration that the complexity of the technology was overwhelming policymakers. Now, our inability to have a proper discussion on these means that we see a distortion of threats and in turn a misapplication of resources to face them. Perhaps the best illustration of this is a number, 31,300. That's the number of news and academic journal articles that have explored the phenomena of cyber terrorism. 0. That's the number of people that have actually been hurt or killed by an actual incident of cyber terrorism. In the book, we joke that in many ways, cyber terrorism is a lot like Discovery Channel's Shark Week, where we obsess about the danger of sharks, even though you're 15,000 times more likely to be hurt on your toilet. Except the difference is that Jaws actually did get someone, or the real-world version of Jaws did get someone, whereas we've not seen this in reality yet, other than Die Hard 4. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that terrorists don't use the internet. And in the book, we have several chapters that explore terrorist use of it, much of which is like how the rest of us use it. And I'm not saying that there is not interest in carrying out acts of cyber terrorism, nor that there wouldn't be impactful effects of them. Indeed, our development of Stuxnet, a cyber weapon that finally had physical powers, caused physical damage in the world, is a great illustration of this. But in turn, Stuxnet illustrates how an effective cyber attack that is real and consequential is also quite difficult. To put it a different way, when it comes to cyber terrorism, Al-Qaeda would like to, but can't. China could, but doesn't want to yet. Now, my point, rather, is that strategy, whether it's at the national level, at the business level, at the individual level, strategy is about choices and priorities. And so we need to weigh the centrality of what we talk about, what we obsess about in our discussions, versus what are arguably not only very real, but more consequential cyber threats out there. It ranges from something that this organization is very familiar with, the massive campaign of intellectual property theft that by most measures you could judge to be the largest theft in all of human history that's ongoing right now. And where's it coming from? If this was a Harry Potter novel, we would describe it as a large Asian power that shall not be named. If we want to think about the national security consequences, not just looking at the consequences of that IP theft and how it plays out, but look beyond the sexy cyber Pearl Harbor descriptions and actually focus on how the military uses this technology and wants to use it, and what is the future of computer network operations and actual campaigns of warfare. To maybe more so, we should be paying attention to the ripple effects, the secondary effects of all of these actions. Because if we use the illustration of terrorism, one of the things we've learned from 9/11 is it's not merely the attack itself, but how we react to it that really stakes its place in history. And so I worry about some of these secondary effects that are playing out, and particularly how they are hammering away at that crucial value that is basically underpinned the internet of trust. And we can see that being damaged by the massive campaigns of cybercrime out there, whether it's the IP theft to credit card and the like. And that's affecting both trust that consumers and users have with the network, and in turn, what the operators have it towards consumers. To trust damage by our government's actions seeking to deal with conventional terrorism, and what that has done to both trust in those agencies, but also trust in America and trust in American technology companies. To finally, what it's done to the internet freedom agenda and the trust in the underlying governance structure of the internet that has worked so effectively for our lifetime. Created this thing that's been arguably the most powerful force for political, economic, social change, certainly in my lifetime, maybe ever. And yet over the next year could be seriously damaged by some international negotiations that are playing out, particularly pushed by authoritarian states like Russia and China. If you like the idea of Russia's 82,000 blacklisted websites, or if you like the building internet wall in China, this may be the future if we don't watch out, particularly as some of the core swing states, the Brazils, the Indias, the Germanys, may not be with us the way they were previously. Now, this gap in the fields also means when it comes to the warfare side, we act on bad assumptions or don't make connections across domains in ways that truly matter. So take the notion of something from the field of war applied here, which is offense, defense, the balance between these. There is an idea that's taken hold that cyber offense is inherently privileged. It's inherently dominant against the defense. And not just now, but as one US military report put it, quote, for the foreseeable future. So for as long as we can see in the future, cyber offense will be dominant is the assumption that's out there. This in turn has driven the US military to spend roughly 4 times as much on cyber offense research and development as it has on cyber defense research and development. Now, the problem with this is a threefold. The first is that cyber offense is not as easy as it's too often depicted. So for example, the former number 2 in the Pentagon described how, quote, a couple of teenagers sitting in their parents' basement, sipping Red Bull and wearing flip-flops could carry out a WMD-style attack. No, they couldn't. They could do a lot of things, but not of what he's portraying. And Stuxnet is a great illustration of that in terms of the wide variety of skill sets that were involved in this. Everything from intelligence analysts and collection to some of the top technical talent in the world from multiple nations, to nuclear physicists, to engineers, to then another espionage effort to get it back in. It was a Manhattan Project style effort. Again, the barriers to entry are lowering, but it's not just, oh, I need a teenager and some Red Bull and I can carry this out. The second is history is replete with examples that every time a military assumed the offense was inherently dominant, that it turned out to be the opposite. And we're on the 100-year anniversary of probably the best illustration of that, where the nations of Europe prior to World War I all assumed that the new technologies of the day meant that the offense was advantaged. In fact, it was so advantaged that you couldn't allow yourself to be stuck on the defensive. So you had to go to war before the other guy could, so that you wouldn't be caught at a disadvantage. And as we saw play out in World War I, actually, it was the defense that turned out to be dominant. But the final issue with this is, even if it's true, it doesn't actually mean that we should be acting the way we are. To give a metaphor, the idea of sitting in your glass house and looking around and saying, gosh, I'm worried about all these roving gangs of teens, well, my best answer is to buy a stone sharpening kit. That's not the logic that we should be following, but that's what we're doing right now. So what can we do instead? The last third of the book is all about these, what can we do questions, everything from global level responses to national level, down to corporate, to you and I. How can we protect ourselves and the broader internet itself? I'm not going to try and summarize that, 100 pages up here, so I'll just hit on 5 themes that cut through all of it. The first theme is knowledge matters. It is vital that we demystify this realm if we ever want to get anything done effective in securing it. We have to move past the situation now where, for example, a White House official described this as, quote, only understood by the nerds. Or when the president himself received a briefing on cybersecurity questions, and at the end of the briefing reportedly asked for it repeated back, quote, this time in English. That's not to beat up on the residents of the White House. That would happen in almost any major company that's not in this space, not in Silicon Valley, but also even small companies, a cupcake stand. It would happen at the White House, it would happen at my house. The second theme leads from this. It's that people matter. Cybersecurity is one of those wicked problem areas that's rife with complexities and trade-offs. And this is in large part not because of the technical side, which often gets too much focus, but rather the people part. Now, it's useful from a writer's perspective because that gives you all the fun characters and stories to populate. My favorite being the time that Pakistan accidentally kidnapped all the world's cute cat videos for a day. But it also means that if you want to set up best responses at the global level, business level, all the way down to the individual level, you need to recognize that the people behind the machines are both part of every single problem and have to be part of every single solution. This leads to the next theme. Incentives matter. If you want to understand why something is or isn't happening in cybersecurity, look to the motivations, the relative costs, the organizations that people are in, the tensions at play between them. There is a reason why, for example, finance companies are doing better at their cybersecurity, both in terms of defending themselves, but also sharing information versus how, for example, critical infrastructure and natural gas or the power grid, how they're not cooperating and not defending themselves well. It's because they're incentivized both to directly understand the costs, but also there's a regulatory environment around them that's driving that. And this points to the role that government can and frankly should be playing in everything from being a trusted information provider to setting standards to, in other situations, it's going to have to create market incentives, which is another way of saying regulation. The fourth is history matters. There is a history to how we got here with the internet, and too often it's ignored. And that's when you hear these sort of silly things like, oh, well, let's just build a new, more secure internet, which is not, it's not a workable concept, and yet it's gotten a lot of credence in policy circles. But more broadly, it means that there's a wealth of lessons to learn from history in other fields. So if we're exploring, for example, how to deal with cyber crime, but also patriotic hacker communities that are linked to states, we look at the age of sail as a parallel, where you had this domain in which commerce, communication, and conflict all played out on the open sea. The conflict actors ranged from state militaries to individual criminal groups, pirates, to these fuzzy things in the middle, privateers, that sort of gave you some of the advantage of pirates, but also state-linked as well. And that's a lesson that we can look to in how we went after that trade. If we want to understand good role for government, let's look at the most successful government agencies in history, like the Centers for Disease Control, which literally started with a couple of scientists taking a $10 collection, a 10 cup for $10, and that agency went on to eradicate malaria inside the United States, to fight smallpox on an international level, to, oh, by the way, served as a critical back channel to the Soviets in the worst part of the Cold War. This leads to the final lesson, and it comes from the saying that Ben Franklin had that, quote, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. What's fascinating is that the CDC did studies and proved that Franklin's saying actually is true in public health. It's also true in cybersecurity and cyber war. Very simple steps of cyber hygiene would have an immense impact. Indeed, one study of the top 20 controls found that they would stop 94% of all cyber attacks. Now, some people react to that and they go, well, I'm really special. I'm in the 6%. Well, statistically, we all can't be in the 6%. But even more so, they should talk to their technical folks, their IT crowd, and they would quickly learn how if they didn't have to spend so much time dealing with the low-level stuff, they could actually focus on the more advanced persistent threats that are out there. And a large part of this, what's interesting, is the data shows that senior executives are actually twice as likely to be behind one of these problems as junior folks, which makes it even more difficult for the IT department to deal with. To give some illustrations of this, let me add one more thing on it. The other challenge of this is that there's this assumption that the advanced threats are all using very advanced pathways in, and yet consistently they're coming in through rather simple approaches. For example, the most important outside penetration of US military networks, of US military classified networks by a foreign espionage agency happened when they conducted what's known as a candy drop. Basically, they dropped memory sticks in a parking lot outside a US military base. And while we learn in preschool, don't take candy from strangers, a US soldier saw the shiny memory stick in the dirt, thought this was really cool, picked it up, wanted to see what was on it, so he took it inside the base and plugged it into his computer, and that was actually the most important penetration of US military networks from the outside. To the insider threat, the episodes of Manning or Snowden, again, wherever you come down on them, we can all agree that the organizations were not following the kind of internal security norms that a cupcake store should have. Monitoring, for example, massively anomalous traffic, things like that. Now, this idea of hygiene is important. And again, when I say hygiene, picking up a memory stick that you find in the dirt, that's basic hygiene. That's the 5-second rule, let alone cyber hygiene. But this idea of hygiene, I think, is important, not just because of that idea of prevention, but even more so the ethic behind it that we need, again, whether we're talking about this on a global level, a national level, a business level, to an individual level. I teach my kids hygiene, wash your hands, cover your mouth when you cough. I teach them that not only to protect themselves, but also that they have a responsibility to protect all that they connect with through the course of their day. That's the same kind of ethic that we need in the online space, and we should be pushing more of that rather than the fears that are out there driving us. So to bring this story full circle, in the beginning I talked about how when I was 7 years old I saw my first computer. Now, if you had told little 7-year-old me that one day this Commodore or its descendants would allow someone to steal your money, steal your identity, even become a weapon of mass disruption, I would have begged and pleaded with my dad not to turn on the power button. Don't let us go into this dangerous, scary world. Today, I wouldn't have it any other way, because that technology has given me and all of us literally superpowers that we didn't imagine back then. We can ask any question and Google the answer to it. Any question, important or not important. Yesterday I was looking up the backstory of a minor noble in the Game of Thrones. That's actually the important example. This technology has given us the power to become friends with people that we've literally never met. All of these great steps forward. And so the same as it was back then, I think is the way it will be in the future. We have to accept and manage the risks of this world, whether it's the online world or the real world, so to speak, because of all that can be achieved in it. And to steal the title from the book, in the end, that's really what everyone needs to know. Thank you.
We'll do a short Q&A. Please wait for the audience mic to arrive to you. And I wanted to mention one more thing that Peter told me about, and this is, there's a website. It's called cybersecuritybook.com, and there's a cybersecurity song playlist there. So I'm curious myself now what that is. Questions?
It seemed like one of the big problems you mentioned was a problem of leadership, and the people who are in power just don't have the sophistication to talk about these issues and make decisions. And I just was wondering what you thought was like the minimum level of competence required by these people, because realistically, I mean, they seem to be pretty entrenched, and I don't think it's realistic to expect a whole new breed of people to come in and make these decisions. And on that point as well, like, how likely do you think it is to be able to get these people to that level of sophistication, given the fact that these people don't know how to use email?
It's a great question, and one part of it, sometimes people say, well, isn't this just a digital native, digital immigrant issue? That digital immigrant, someone who grew up in the world without computers and then now has moved into this world, versus a native who was born into it, and it all seems natural and intuitive. And so, can't we? This problem, won't it just solve itself? Is how they sometimes reference it. First, there's a long period of time before the immigrants, so to speak, move out of the positions of power. To put it a different way, there's a quote in the book from a guy who talks about how the folks that are sitting in the big boy chairs, is how he phrased it. The big boy chairs in government or at CEOs of a lot of different companies or the like, many of them didn't see or use their first computer until they were in their 30s or 40s. But it doesn't mean, one, they're going to be in those positions for a long time, and so we've got this gap, this period of time, we can't wait it out. The second is a lot of digital natives don't have this intuitively the way it's assumed, in large part because of how we've stovepiped these issues. That's for the IT folks to handle, or the IT folks saying, oh, well, that's for legal to handle, that's not for us. And so to your question of what's the level of expertise, I don't think there's sort of a common test that everyone has to pass or something like that. I actually, and this may be a little bit controversial, I don't think it's even about people knowing how to do things like computer program. Maybe it's controversial in this room. It's instead having familiarity of the key concepts, the key terms, so that, frankly, they can have a good argument about it. You can see this in what's playing out with the NSA issues recently, where both the mass media, but also both sides in Congress that are arguing it, it's just so factually disconnected. And so they're not able to even have a good an argument about it. I use that illustration of offense-defense theory. It's a great way of showing this, where on one hand, the people that understand the technical side don't know that there's actually a very rich literature in international relations of offense, defense. It doesn't lead you to one conclusion or the other. And they picked one part of it and said, this is the conclusion of what we should take. In turn, the IR crowd doesn't understand this all that well. The bigger thing is not a level of knowledge, it's an attitude. There's too much Ludditism out there that's celebrated. A senior government official who had responsibility for this, literally saying doesn't think it's all that useful. And she did the same thing that the SecDef did, where if their email came in, it's printed out by the assistant, they write their answer on it, and then they hand it back. You can't be effective if that's the kind of attitude that you have both for your internal, but you think it's okay to talk to others about it that way. And so for me, it's, again, there's some base level of knowledge, but it's more about changing the attitudes around it, and frankly, stop looking at this as just a highly technical issue for, again, for the it crowd or for the nerds.
What principles have we learned from the behavior of immune systems in biology, and from the resilience of biological networks all the way from metabolic networks up to ecologies? What principles have we learned that we are not yet applying in cybersecurity?
That's actually a great question to bridge back to the prior question, because that all-important word that you used, resilience, is what I think should be at the centerpiece of our approaches and our discussions and the like, where too often, and you see this again on the government side, but also in on the business side. Basically, there's this mentality of offense, defense, and defense, it's, build higher or thicker walls. And then the offense side is, weirdly enough, coming back into the private sector with the emergence of the potential hackback industry of, the best way to protect yourself is not just to build a high wall, but we'll go after the bad guys for you. It's a version of, it's basically a business version of vigilantism. It has major concerns for international relations because it could quickly escalate things in a way that's unplanned. It's also a horrible business model for the clients. Vigilantism only worked for Charles Bronson. If this idea of the best way to defend yourself from multiple, I'm going to go after this guy, and then you're attacking, I'll go after this guy, this guy, this guy, and so at the end of the day, all you're doing is paying someone to go after others for you, not actually making yourself secure. Instead of this mentality, it goes to what you asked about, resilience, and you can think about this in the physiological way, and that turns on everything from the notion of it being not a Cold War, this idea of we're in a new Cold War. It's literally a quote from folks. One, malware is not like the physics of a nuclear weapon. Second, there's not the bipolar relationship of two powers. The players in cybersecurity are just like the players in cyberspace. It's everything from the 100 cyber military units out there to non-state collectives interested in everything from cute cats to online protests to corporations that range from Google to Target to the cupcake store. And so it doesn't fit that to the online battle of ideas is not the ideological Cold War battle that it's framed. The online battle of ideas go on YouTube and you can see the diversity of them. And so instead, it's this ecosystem of players. And then it goes to the idea of the physiological approach of your own body. Our bodies are probably the most resilient thing ever created. They're designed for a world that's incredibly hostile. They expect that bad things are going to happen. They have a really great exterior line of defense, your skin, but they fully plan that skin at some point will definitely be penetrated. And it has all sorts of systems to react to that. Everything from stemming the flow to monitoring the infection, internal monitoring systems to your body triages between what's important and what's not, to guess what? Your body itself operates on the assumption that something external is already inside. There's 10 times as much, when you look at the number of cell counts, there's 10 times as much bacteria and the like in your body than there are human cells. Again, compare that to the typical, just buy my widget, or I have a better, stronger password, I'll keep them out. But there's another idea of resilience that I don't think we pay enough attention to, and that's psychological resilience. There's 3,000 books on psychological resilience of some sort. Resilience in your job, resilience in your love life, and et cetera. And it's all built around the idea that you can't go through life thinking that bad things will never happen or they can all be deterred or defeated. Instead, that your success is dependent on your assumption that bad things will play out, but it's all about how will you power through them? How will you recover quickly from them? How will you not allow them to knock you down in the way that they could? All these different ways. And again, you can think about it in your love life, to your job, whatever. we need that same mentality when it comes to cyber. So take cyber terrorism, the central discussion of, oh my God, the power grid might go down. And in fact, you've seen all of these false news reports about times that cyber attacks caused it, which either in one situation the power didn't go out, it's a false story that, guess what, 60 Minutes unsurprisingly covered, to in other situations, things that are described as cyber attacks that they're not. So 2 dudes with a rifle, that's not a cyber attack. But that was recently in the news, covered as in this. The bottom line is that squirrels have taken down more power grids than the 0 times that hackers have. But it's, again, it could play out, but it's all about how will we react to it. Where I live in outside Washington, the power went down multiple times this summer. But if it had been a cyber attack that caused it, we would have had, a congressional commission investigating who to blame, and we would have had mass hysteria around it. And so what I would prefer, and I go back to that echo of 9/11 and how you react, is the British mentality to terrorism: keep calm and carry on, rather than the American model, which is, we try and out-escalate the hype and the fear around it, because we're seeing more gains in the fear and hype. And my worry is that's carrying over to the cyber side.
The cybercrime that really matters in the Snowden story is not what Snowden did, but what he revealed. Alexander has 2 mandates, both offense and defense. And as we've seen, and as you've said, the offense has dominated in his activities. But whether offense is inevitably dominates, as they seem to think, and as as is premised behind their actions, they've loaded the dice. Part of what they've done is, rather than also act on their defensive mandate, they have purposely gone out and inserted vulnerabilities, worked with vendors of security software to purposely insert vulnerabilities, making us more vulnerable. And as you've said, incentives matter. Let's take a look, in the absence of Snowden, let's take a look at the incentives on secret intelligence agencies themselves. What is the bureaucratic reward for successfully carrying out an attack? And what is the bureaucratic reward for successfully preventing attacks that aren't visible because they couldn't happen? Okay? The second is invisible. There's the bureaucratic reward structure has no means to reward it. And in the absence of Snowden, the first is cost-free.
I'm in agreement with you on a couple of areas. One on the notion of incentives. And again, you can see that whether you're talking about within that intelligence agency to why we see on the defense side certain industries cooperate or not, and it all turns on that. But then there's the broader, essentially you pulled the bandage of Snowden, and so we've got to go at it. And you began by hitting one part of his activity, and I think this is the challenge right now in the discussion and debate around him, the NSA. Is he a traitor? Is he a whistleblower? Should he get clemency or the like? Is that essentially he gathered and now is being released. Actually not by him. This is one of the myths that's out there. It's not him pulling the strings right now. It's the journalists, they're actually going through it. And the challenge for them is, because there's so much, it actually involves, again, a very different set of expertise. So someone who understands the technology will not get, then when they'll see a name pop up that, say, the Latin America beat reporter will go, whoa, 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 that name, that guy's now the deputy foreign minister of Brazil. That name is meaningless to the person who knows what this acronym means, that the Latin America reporter doesn't know that. And then in turn you need the spine like. So they're actually having these teams go through it and figuring out what's newsworthy or not. And so but the bottom line is there's such a mass of information and a wide variety of stories that have come out and will continue to come out, is that it essentially falls into three very different buckets of activity that has been disclosed. The first bucket of activity is, frankly, what I would describe as smart strategic espionage against American enemies. And you hit sort of the mentality that drives some of that. Now, there's an issue of, you said they, when you're talking about NSA versus Cyber Command, and they're at the top, military intelligence. But the bottom line is, one bucket of activity was things that we would expect and want an agency to do. Going after monitoring terror rings in Pakistan, Iranian nuclear research, China, et cetera. Bucket number two is what I would term questionable. Activities that there is a debate around because it involves US citizens in some way, shape, or form, either through legal approaches on the front door, to back door, to running with an authorization in a way that the policymaker that authorized it didn't understand what was authorized, to essentially deals made with foreign intelligence agencies where they were able to collect things in a way that we couldn't, and exchange of information and the like. But basically, the debate around involvement of US citizens. Category 3 is the bucket that I would describe as unstrategic, or more directly, stupid. And that is targeting of close American allies and American technology companies. And the resonance of that is everything from how I mentioned the hammering to other kinds of international negotiations that may matter more, to, as you mentioned, the undermining of cybersecurity for all of us, particularly based on this assumption that they were the only ones smart enough to find the vulnerability. But then more broadly, what it's done to that critical word, trust in American technology companies, and the resonance of that, at least according to Forrester Research, is that your industry will lose approximately $180 billion worth of revenue. That's why people here are pissed. The problem, though, is that in the debate around it, we pull from whichever bucket we care most about. So if you care most about classic national security, you go, this guy disclosed things that are important. He is a traitor, da-da-da-da-da-da. If you care about the privacy Fourth Amendment questions, you only talk about those. And that's what he's a whistleblower, and clemency and the like. We see it also in how we defend it from the narrative on the government side. So these kind of activities are to prevent another 9/11, which may describe bucket 2 and the metadata and the like, but that doesn't make the Germans feel better about why you were going after Angela Merkel's messages or the like. And so the problem is, it's all of these things at once, and it's muddied the water of the discussions. And we can even see this most recently in the president's speech, which again focused primarily on one of the buckets, mostly the privacy side, because that's what matters most in the American political debate, but it actually may not matter the most in the long-term national security and economic prosperity of the nation, which is weird and scary to say.
Just a question on how Silicon Valley companies can partner with each other and with the government to actually have better government surveillance policies, right? Recently we saw the government surveillance reform where 7 companies have gone together, and again it's going back to your notion of us versus them, where they're, instead of partnering, it's now they're pushing for reforms and wasting lobbying dollars and stuff, while it could be a better partnership. So what are your thoughts on what we could do as
there's steps that can be taken, but one of the underlying things is attitude. And it's funny, I was out here little over a year ago, and there was sort of an attitude towards, DC is so dysfunctional, nothing could get done there, you guys are so problematic, we don't want anything to do with you. And we don't need anything to do with you. And then now we see the flip side of that, of actually what you do matters to us. You're still dysfunctional, but it matters to us. And in turn, you saw that approach from, again, this is from the stovepiping, individuals pursuing a certain political goal and within just a limited circle, not understanding the ripple effects of what they were doing on lots of other areas, including one of the cornerstones of American prosperity, which is our technology industry. And so the problem is first knocking down that attitude that neither side matters to the other and doesn't need to understand the other. We'll also have to, too often Silicon Valley, and I even saw it sort of the reaction when I said this in the speech, will offer a seeming technologic solution to a problem. There's far more engineers out here than almost any other specialty, and so there's often, we can engineer our way out of it some way, shape, or form. And we even see that now in this discussion over privacy, where it was, okay, we can't figure out what to do, but Attorney General and head of national intelligence, you got 60 days to figure out this solution. And we see different sort of things offered that are sort of a technical solution. It's not going to be a technical solution. It's going to be a awful, painful grind of policy and votes and court decisions and lobbying and all these other things that go into the nasty sausage of political process. But in terms of what I'm getting at, too often we fail to look at the human side of what can be done, and that would be another aspect of it. But the bottom line is we clearly have a shared stake in it, and I hope we can raise the level of discourse and raise the level of cooperation.
Hi, Peter. Great to see the book finally come out. What are you optimistic about?
Look, I'm actually hugely optimistic about this. The possibilities of this technology, what it's allowed to accomplish, and in turn, the people who misuse it and what they're costing themselves. And that misuse is, everything from, I mentioned there's very real danger of a balkanization of the internet. On the other hand, the cost of that to those nations, it will be staggering. A flip way of putting it is, if you wanted, there's one nation that has really, really great cybersecurity and protections, North Korea. There's a cost to that. And so, to me, and we can see this in turn on, the debate around the NSA to businesses. I gave all these anecdotes of how they're not doing it well, but now they're facing cost to it. The recent examples of, be it Target or Snapchat or Neiman Marcus, is that there's an ebb and flow, and people that mishandle it face costs. And so to me, that's where we'll see reactions. The incentives will drive it. So I'm actually, if there's any message from the book, it's that this is seemingly scary stuff, and some of it should be scary, but on the other hand, we can't have a good discussion if it's like Spinal Tap and the volume's always at 11, which has been how we've talked about it. And so the goal of the book was basically to fill this kind of sweet spot where you either had this highly technical discussion that was exclusionary, or you had the histrionic side. And instead, I think this can be a topic, I think it has to be a topic that we're all better equipped to talk about. And I'm optimistic that when we do understand this, we can go much further than where we're at right now.
And on this optimistic note, please give a hand to Peter Singer.
Great, thank you.